In this tutorial, you'll learn how to build an application with Flask and HTMX. If you want to host an HTMX and Flask application on our platform as a service, that is on Code Capsules, you can find a short deployment guide here. This deployment guide uses this same project we are building here, and I've put the link in the description below. Recent trends in the modern web saw single-page frameworks like React.js and Angular take over traditional multi-page websites, mainly due to the lack of interactivity offered by HTML. It is worth noting, however, that single-page applications, SPAs, brought this interactivity at the cost of added complexity. This is where a new HTML extension called HTMX enters and shines. HTMX gives traditional HTML sites more interactivity while keeping things simple, as it allows you to make requests from any HTML element and not just anchor and form tags. But this is not HTMX's only benefit. Other benefits include making it possible to perform partial page reloads in HTML, support for put and delete methods in addition to get and post methods, not being limited to click and submit event triggers only, and lastly, lightweight setup. There is no additional dependencies that need to be installed to get it working. In this tutorial, we will explore the benefits of HTMX by building a full-stack application using Flask and HTMX. I'll be following this tutorial here, so that's where you can copy and paste the code. The link is in the description below. Our application will be a book recommendation app that supports CRUD, that is, create, read, update, delete functionality. The final app will look like this. After building our application, you'll want to deploy it to production so that you can show it to friends and family. You will therefore need the following to complete the tutorial: Git setup and installed, and a registered GitHub account, Python 3 installed, and lastly, an IDE or text editor of your choice. I'll be using Visual Studio Code. With all the requirements in place, as you can see, I have Git installed, Python installed, and a GitHub account. We can now go ahead and set up our project. Now let's create a folder to house our application's source code. So run the commands below in the terminal or command prompt if you're using Windows to create the folder. I'm just using this terminal provided by Visual Studio Code, but it will work even if you just run it in command prompt. So let me just clear the screen and then type in make directory and then type in Flask HTMX. This will create a directory called Flask HTMX. Then what we need to do is to navigate into that folder. So just type in cd Flask HTMX. From here onwards, Flask-HTMX directory will be referred to as the project's root folder. Now we need to create a virtual environment. A virtual environment allows you to isolate the packages required to develop Python applications from your computer system. We recommend you use a new virtual environment for every application you develop so as to not corrupt dependencies for other applications. In the terminal, run the following command to create a virtual environment within the project's root folder. I am using the command Python because it's mapped to my Python 3 installation. If yours is not mapped, then use Python 3 instead. So instead of Python, you'll have Python 3. Notice here that we now have an env subdirectory. If you're on Windows, activate the virtual environment by entering .env/scripts/activate. If you're on macOS or Linux, enter source space env/bin/activate and then press enter. After activating the virtual environment, the name env should appear in brackets on the leftmost part of your terminal in your current line. This signals that the activation was successful. We can now install our required packages to the virtual environment we just activated. So run the following command to install Flask, Flask SQL Alchemy, and GUnicorn. pip3 install Flask, Flask-SQL Alchemy, GUnicorn. You might notice that there is no dependency for HTMX in our dependency list. This is because it will be added as a script tag inside the head of our HTML templates. Press enter to install the dependencies. With the installation successful, we now need to initialize an empty Git repository. So while you're in the project's root folder, enter the command git init to initialize a Git repository. This will allow you to track changes to your app as you build it. Then create a .gitignore file. In macOS or Linux, simply type in touch.gitignore. In Windows, type notepad.gitignore. Accept the prompt to create the new file, and then add the following line to it: env/. This excludes the env folder from being tracked by Git, as we only want to track changes in our project files. Then you can close it, save changes, and as you can see here, we have our .gitignore file. The next thing that we need to do is to link to GitHub. So head over to GitHub and create a new repository. I'm going to call my repository Flask HTMX and just keep it public, and then click on Create Repository. Then go back to your project's root folder and run the following command from the terminal: git remote add origin git@github.com username /repository name.git. Now replace username with your username. Mine is devritsa. And the repository name with your repository name. Mine is Flask HTMX. And then press enter. This will link your local repository to the one on GitHub. With the setup complete, we can now begin building our app. We will start with the HTMX front end, and for this you need to create an app templates folder inside the project's root folder. So here inside the project's root folder, I'm going to create a folder and name it app. And then inside the app folder, I'm going to create another folder and name it templates. Inside the templates folder, create an index.html file. Then populate the index.html file with the following code. There is not much going on in the snippet above except for line 5 and 8. Line 5 is loading Bootstrap and line 8 is loading HTMX into our index.html page. This gives you the power to build an interactive page just by including the script tag that links to HTMX without needing to install any npm packages like most single-page applications. This is how HTMX allows you to build sites that are more lightweight compared to single-page application frameworks. The code between the style tags adds CSS to style our front end and make it more visually appealing. Now let's add the code that will be rendered in the body tag of our page. Copy and paste the code underneath the head tag and replace this comment that says place body code here. There are a couple of attributes here that are not used in traditional HTML. Let's go over them one by one. hx-http method. Examples of this attribute include hx-post, hx-put, hx-get, and hx-delete. This is the HTMX way of denoting what type of request should be sent on form submission or when a request firing event is triggered. These attributes accept the request route, or as I prefer to pronounce it, route, as an argument. In our case, we use the submit route, while the table buttons send requests to the delete and get edit form routes. hx-target. This attribute accepts the ID of the element you want to update after a successful request or when an event is triggered. Take note of the preceding hash that's written before the ID value. You might have noticed that we didn't use an ID value in the table, but used a value of closest tr instead. This swaps the closest table row with the HTML that will be returned by the request when an action is triggered. The closest row will always be the same row in which an event or request was triggered, either by the edit title button or the delete button. hx-swap. The hx-swap attribute allows you to specify how you want to partially reload the page or swap elements with new ones. It updates the user interface in the section specified in the hx-target attribute. In our form, we use the before and value to tell HTMX that we want to append the result of the request after the last child in the target element, which is the table with the ID new-book. In the table, however, we use the outer HTML value to denote that we want to swap the entire table row element with the returned content. A full list of acceptable hx.swap values can be viewed here. With the front end done, we can now dive into the back end of our app. So just save your changes and then create a run.py file in the project's root folder. Populate the run.py file with the following code. This is the point of entry for any server wishing to run our app. Just save it, and then we can close it. We then need to create an init file in the app folder. Then paste in the following code. We have our imports here, and here we declare our app object using the Flask package we installed earlier. We will be using a SQLite database, which we configure using the app.config lines. We will use SQL Alchemy to declare the database object we'll interact with. SQL Alchemy allows us to read and write to the database using object notation, which is more familiar than raw SQL statements. It is important to import the models only after declaring the database object so that their respective tables are included in the database when it's created. The last two lines handle the initialization of the database and the creation of all relevant tables in the database based on the models that are imported. So just save the file and move on to the next step. The next step is to create the models.py module we imported earlier in the init.py file. So create a file named models.py. And then populate it with the following code. Here we declare the two models we're going to be saving in our database. The two models are author and book. It is worth noting the one-to-many relationship between author and books, as an author can have many books, but each book can only have a single author in the context of this application. We denote this relationship by using a foreign key in the author ID field of the book and a backref in the books field of an author. The last part in building the backend of our app is to create the views or routes that the front end will be interacting with. Create a views.py file inside the app folder and add the following code to it. In the code snippet above, we've added the index root and bound the home function to it. The home function first queries the database to get a list of all the books before returning the index.html template that's populated with the list of books. Now we need to add our submit route, so add the following code below the index route. When a person submits a new book, this is the route that's called. The logic first checks if the author already exists in the database, and if so, saves the book with the author's author ID. Otherwise, it creates a new author and then saves the book. As HTMX expects an HTML response, the submit method responds with an HTML table row that updates the list of books on the front end. The new entry will be for the recently added book. Now let's add the code for the delete route. The first thing you may have noticed about this route is the ID query parameter it accepts. This allows us to know which object to delete. After deleting the book, we return an empty string, which causes the row we deleted in the front end to disappear as it is swapped for nothing. We now have routes for creating, reading, and deleting books. It's time to add views associated with updating book entries in order to complete our application's CRUD functionality. Add the following code to views.py to add logic for updating book entries to your app. There is more than one view for the update logic, and we'll see shortly why. The getEditForm route is called when a user clicks on the Edit Title button on the front end, and it returns a form for updating the selected book. If the user decides to cancel this action, the getBookRow route is called and it returns a table row with the unedited book entry. If the user goes through with updating the book title, then the update route is called. The update book function that is bound to the update route will update the book title based on the ID supplied to it as a query parameter. When the update is complete, the method returns an HTML table row with the updated book title. At this point, our app is ready to be tested. So just save the file and open terminal. So navigate to the project's root folder. As you can see, I'm already in Flask-HTMX, and make sure that you are in the virtual environment. As you can see, I am not in the virtual environment, so I have to activate it first. So run the following command to activate it. Once in the virtual environment, run python run.py. This should start up a development server on port 5000. Now open your browser at this address and you should see the app running. As you can see, we don't have any books here. So let's add a couple of books. The first one I'm going to add is Harry Potter, and the author is J.K. Rowling. As you can see, our book has been added. Let's add 3 more books. And the last book, Think and Grow Rich, by Napoleon Hill. We have tested creating and reading books. Now let's test deleting and updating books. So you can see here I made a mistake on the author, supposed to be J.K. Rowling, but there's no way to edit the author, so I'm going to delete this book. And then I'm going to add another one. This time I'm just going to call it Harry. And on the author, I'm going to put J.K. Rowling and then submit. As you can see, my book was added. Now I can edit the title to add in the Potter. And then click on save. And now it's updated. So you can see deleting and updating is working. Once you are satisfied with the app, you can commit and push your changes to GitHub. So go back to the terminal, press Ctrl+C to quit, clear the screen. Then type in git add space period and then git commit space -m and then put your commit message. Mine is going to be initial commit. And then to push it to GitHub, type in git push origin. I got an error that the current branch master has no upstream branch. So I need to run git push set upstream origin master. I'm going to choose sign in with your browser. In the pop-up that comes, I'm going to click on authorize. And then I need to put in my password. And then confirm password. Authentication succeeded. I can now return to the application, which is the terminal. As you can see, the push was successful. Now if you go back to GitHub, and refresh on the repo, you will now see our one commit, initial commit. We have shown you how to build a full stack Flask HTMX application from scratch, and you should be able to deploy this basic version. But you may like to consider adding more functionality to enhance the app's features. We recommend you check out alpine.js, which is a lightweight JavaScript framework that works well with HTMX to make sites that are more powerful yet still lightweight. All the code shown in this tutorial can be found in this Code Capsules GitHub repository.